Hey guys, my name is Drew. Welcome. Well, I was about to say welcome back. I guess welcome to NFL Trading Room because this will be our first video. Welcome to NFL Trading Room. This is Fantasy Trading Room's NFL Draft branch channel. We're going to be bringing you guys year-long NFL Draft content. And as of recording this, we are officially 1 week out of the 2025 NFL Draft. So today, I'm going to be walking you guys through my final 2025 NFL mock draft, why I think each of these picks can be made. This is going to be predictive, not necessarily reflective of my board or my thoughts on these players. This is meant to be what I think is going to happen in about a week. And without further ado, let's get into it. So with the first pick, Tennessee Titans are officially on the clock beginning into this draft. Not going to do any trades throughout this. There will be plenty of trades on draft night, but I think those are too wildly unpredictable to try and guess what's going to happen here. So this is just going to be making the picks as they are in the draft order. And with the first pick, Tennessee, this is the worst kept secret in the NFL. It's been Cam Ward for weeks. Ever since the combine, when they got Cam Ward in the interview room on the whiteboard, they fell in love with who he is as a player, as a football mind, as a person. There's been tons and tons of trade smoke around this first overall pick throughout this whole process. But Tennessee is in love with Cam Ward. They have been for a very long time. This pick has been solidified for a while now. So the draft really does start at 2. And while saying that, the Cleveland Browns are on the clock. And I think this pick is also pretty solidified to me, but I think it's less so than the first overall pick. The options here are really between the Colorado players, to my knowledge. It's going to be between, Travis Hunter, the generational guy in this class, the corner and receiver, athlete just at the position. And that's who I believe the pick will be. I think Shedeur Sanders, the QB out of Colorado, is also very much in play. Cleveland likes Shedeur Sanders. He matches Stefanski's system. He'd be a great fit there. The QB coach, the new QB coach in Cleveland, has a long history with Dion. There's a lot of connective tissue there. But generally, I think Cleveland is looking to just grab the best talent they can in this draft. And to me, or to them, I should say, to my knowledge, is Travis Hunter. So they're going to go and get who many people in the NFL believe is the best player in this draft class. I believe, Andrew Berry has been on record saying they see him as a wide receiver first rather than a corner, which is not personally how I see him. But there's plenty of NFL teams that do see him as a receiver first, so I imagine they'll look to play him there. But the Cleveland Browns will go Travis Hunter out of Colorado there. And at number 3 is the Giants. And we've seen a lot of quarterback smoke around them. They've had private workouts with Shedeur Sanders as well as multiple other quarterbacks in this draft class in recent days. As of recording this, there's been a lot of smoke around Shedeur Sanders there. But at the end of the day, I think Daboll and Joe Shane, they both know their days are limited there. The owners know that, and I don't think the owners are really looking to have a panicked QB pick from a dying regime who probably doesn't have more than 1 year left at this point. So I think the Giants are kind of going to be forced into just going best player available. They know they can't get a QB for the future in this draft class. So they're just going to punt and kick the can down the road, to compete in that QB class next year that appears to be pretty stacked. So I think at number 3, the New York Giants are going to go Abdul Carter, the edge rusher out of Penn State. In my opinion, the best player in this draft class. Super explosive coming off the edge, super bendy. I think he's going to be an absolute force on the edge. You look, Kayvon Thibodeau has not been the piece they wanted him to be. So you get an Abdul Carter opposite of Brian Burns, and you've got a really, really dangerous defensive front there, obviously with Dexter Lawrence there in the middle. That's a really scary front seven in New York. And this is kind of a nightmare scenario for the Patriots at 4 because, they're a team that was looking to get one of the 2 blue chip players in this class at 4. They would like for 2 quarterbacks to go in the top 3. But, from what I know, I don't see that happening. And I think, you saw they get Drake May last year. He really, really struggled with that offensive line, had pretty easily the worst offensive line in the NFL in New England this past year. And Armand Mimbo, the tackle out of Missouri, has a guy that has just continuously, steadily climbed draft boards throughout this whole process. I think he's bordering on that blue chip level, in my opinion. Extremely talented tackle, very, very good run blocker, super technically sound, massive frame, good athlete. And I think he's a great cornerstone piece to kick off this offensive line rebuild. To protect Drake May in New England, and I think that's where they're going to go at 4. You got Mike Vrabel in there. He's going to try to build through the trenches. He's a trench guy. And then getting to Jacksonville here at 5, I think we're kind of starting to go some different directions because of some prospect fatigue. We've talked about the same player in the same spot for this entire draft cycle, but I think we've been doing that for a reason. We've talked about Mason Graham, the defensive lineman out of Michigan, so often to Jacksonville here. And I think, we're kind of tired of that. I understand it's kind of drawn out and boring at this point. But I think Mason Graham is a great fit in Jacksonville. I think he's a top 3 or 4 player in this class. And I think Jacksonville has a gaping hole at interior defensive lineman. Eric Armstead was not nearly the piece you wanted. They don't have many contributors there. And I think Mason Graham is a great fit there, and that's where they're going to go at 5. And the Raiders at 6 are a team that has been looked at a couple different directions. You have a brand new head coach in Pete Carroll, a brand new GM, a lot of different directions they could go, a lot of holes in this roster, a lot of places they need to address. But you've seen Armand Mimbo go off the board already. And I think if Armand Mimbo is there at 6, that's probably a more likely selection. I think they really like Mimbo, but I don't know if he's going to be there. And I think, talking about another boring pick, we've talked about ever since the Geno Smith trade that happened during this draft cycle. I think Ashton Jeanty, we've been talking about that for a reason. The blue chip player, in my opinion, top 4 player in this draft class, best running back I've ever graded personally. And I think, with how many holes they have, you kind of just have to start somewhere, and starting with a blue chip running back is never a bad idea. Take some of that pressure off of Geno Smith, add in a really strong rushing attack there. You already have an offensive line in place. Pretty good, good enough there in LA, or Las Vegas, excuse me. And I think Jeanty will be the pick there, even though it's kind of the boring pick we've talked about for so long. On the Jets, this is where it really gets interesting, is in the back half of the top 10. And this is kind of a nightmare scenario for the Jets. You have Armand Mimbo off the board. You have Mason Graham off the board, which I think are their 2 best options. And this is where you kind of have to pivot to some further options down the board. And I think where the Jets will go, if this is how the board falls, it will be Tyler Warren, the tight end out of Penn State, who I would not personally think this high, but I think the Jets really, really love him. They have a massive hole at tight end. They want to get a guy who's a versatile weapon, like Tyler Warren was on that Penn State offense. Everything ran through him. Very, very versatile, great blocker, good receiver. On the older side, but he's a good enough athlete, pretty good separator. The NFL is extremely high on him, to what I know, and I think the Jets probably don't let him fall past 7, assuming Mimbo and Mason Graham are gone. And the Panthers coming up here at 8 are another team that has been linked to a select few prospects, but I think they've kind of tipped their hand more than most would in this draft cycle, and I think they can, because there's not really anybody who's a threat of taking him ahead of them, but it's going to be Jalen Walker, the linebacker edge hybrid out of Georgia, who's a top 5 player, top 6 player on my board personally. I love Jalen Walker. I have no issues taking him this high. The Panthers have been extremely, open about their love for both Georgia guys. They like Michael Williams, as well as Jalen Walker. I think, you've seen some Shamar Stewart smoke around this pick. You've seen some Ted McMillan smoke around this pick. Ultimately, I think they love Jalen Walker. They've been open about the relationship they've built over this draft cycle with him. And I think that will be the pick. Get a guy on a defense that needs a lot of help, and you get a hybrid guy that can play 2 roles extremely well at a high level. And here at New Orleans, pick number 9 is where things get really, really interesting, because you've seen, obviously we had the Derek Carr news break, not too long ago. Derek Carr has an undisclosed shoulder injury that may keep him sidelined for all of 2025, which is crazy to say, for just to come out of nowhere. They might not even have their quarterback. We're looking at Spencer Rattler starting for them coming out of here. But we're seeing Shadur Sanders slide. We talked about this guy as a top 3 guy for most of this draft cycle, but in this scenario, you see him slip a little bit, and I think New Orleans probably pulls the trigger on a Shadur Sanders. You get a franchise quarterback in there. It's somebody who I would not take in the first round personally, but I think there's some NFL teams that are really high on him. And you've got a desperate QB situation down there in New Orleans, and a fan base that needs to be revitalized, because you've been in cap hell for so long in New Orleans. And you see him slip to 9, and I think New Orleans finally pulls the trigger on the second quarterback off of the board. And Chicago is where I think things get really difficult for the first time when you're mock drafting here. Because you saw this team basically completely address their offensive line. Their offensive line set in the stone. There's so many pieces in place on that offense for what they've done the past 2 years. They set things up really well for Caleb Williams. You got Ben Johnson, obviously first-year head coach in there. Got really high expectations for him and what he's going to do in Chicago. I think when you look at the needs for Chicago, the 2 most glaring are running back and edge. And with Ashton Jeanty off the board, you want to look at edge, but I don't know, with Ben Johnson being there as a first-year head coach, I think he's really going to want a running back. We've seen him move on from DeAndre Swift once, and I think there has been some smoke around Marion Hampton at 10, and I think that's not a crazy pick by any means. I think Marion Hampton is a really, really good player. He's an RB1 in almost any draft class that doesn't include Ashton Jeanty. So I think the pick will be a Marion Hampton here at 10. People think it's rich for running back. I understand that, but you've got a pretty solidified roster. You want to continue to support Caleb Williams, and Ben Johnson has showed how important running backs are to him and his offense. Like we said, he's already moved on from DeAndre Swift once, so I think he goes and gets his running back of the future at pick number 10. And here at pick number 11 is the San Francisco 49ers, who have really gutted most of their team this offseason. You've got major needs on the defensive side of the ball. You've got major needs at offensive line. Trent Williams is probably questionable how many more years he's got left in him. That interior offensive line is a mess outside of the guard that they have had work out so well recently, their pick last year. And I think with Will Campbell falling out of the top 10, I think this is probably where the trigger gets pulled on him. A guy with so much versatility across the offensive line can really plug and play wherever you need him, whether that's a tackle, whether that's a guard. I see him as a guard personally, but I know NFL teams see him differently across the league. And I think San Francisco will look to rebolster that offensive line and plug Will Campbell wherever he can fit there. And Dallas is on the clock at 12. And I think this is where we see the first receiver go off the board. Receivers are really hard to fit in this when mock drafting for this draft cycle, because I think there's just very, very few teams in this first round that are in a position to take one. And also, I don't think this receiver class is particularly good. But I think Dallas is one where you probably will see a receiver go. I have a hard time not picking Jihad Campbell for them, because that inside linebacker room is so weak, and I think Jihad Campbell is a top 10 player in this draft. But I think I really do, in my heart of hearts, believe they're going to go receiver, and I think you see a guy stay in Texas in Matthew Golden, moving from Austin to Dallas. And Matthew Golden will go there and play opposite of CeeDee Lamb. You've really got no other weapons on that offense outside of him. Matthew Golden's a guy that's incredibly versatile, can play all three receiver positions, so you can really float him wherever CeeDee Lamb isn't, and he's going to find success. And you're going to see them try to help out Dak as he comes back being healthy. Here with Miami on the clock at pick 13, this is another really interesting one, because I think receiver is an option for them too. I don't necessarily think they go that direction, but it's on the table. Jalen Waddle had a down year. I think you see Tyreek Hill get moved very, very soon. If it's not during the draft, I think it'll be right after. I think his days in Miami are done. But this is a team that also needs offensive line help. But I think you see the top end options in the first round of offensive line being gone already. I think they could use safety. Losing Javon Holland, like a Malachi Starks or a Nick Emenwari would work really, really well here. But I think they're probably going to go Jahdae Barron, the corner out of Texas, who I see as a nickel. I think most of the NFL does as well. There's some size limitations there. That's not a knock. People have kind of misconstrued labeling guys a nickel corner to be an insult when it's really not. That's one of the most valuable positions in modern NFL defenses, and Jahdae Barron is a guy with all-pro nickel potential as a rookie, in my opinion. The NFL is also extremely high on him. They can't stop talking about him. He's such a cerebral player. He knocked the interview process out of the park. So I think Jahdae Barron is going to be a guy that goes a lot higher than most teams think. And the Colts here on the clock at pick 14 are where the Jihad Campbell slide stops, in my opinion. You saw them lose EJ Speed in this offseason. They need some help on the defensive side of the ball. They love Jihad Campbell, from what I know. I believe 14 is the floor for him. I know you saw the labrum injury. He's got a knee injury that's kind of bothered him and doesn't look to be going away. But Jihad Campbell's another guy the NFL just can't stop talking about. They love his football mind, the athletic ability, the versatility he brings. And I think he's going to be the EJ Speed replacement and really anchor the middle of that Indianapolis defense, which really sucks for Atlanta on the clock at 15, because they would have been a team that loves Jihad Campbell. You've got kind of a need in the front seven there. Matthew Judon was not the piece you really wanted him to be as a premier edge rusher. So you've got a hole at edge. You've got Caden Ellis kind of playing that hybrid role, but he's not a guy you can really fully count on. To me, there's not an inside linebacker I'd feel comfortable taking here past Jihad Campbell. Edge is where it gets interesting, because I think you've got, Mike Green, I think, is a really, really good player who I think is worth taking in the middle here, but you got some really scary off-field concerns. And to my knowledge, I think Atlanta's pretty out on him because of that reason. So I don't see them going Mike Green, even though a lot of people mock him there. And I understand why, just purely from a player perspective, but I do think Atlanta's too hung up on the character concerns to take that shot. Now, to me, I see this pick being Malachi Starks, the safety out of Georgia. You see a guy stay in state, hometown guy in Georgia. They've already got, Jesse Bates, one of the better safeties in the league back there. But you've got Malachi Starks, who is one of the most versatile DBs in this class, in my opinion, one of the most versatile DBs I've ever watched. This is a guy that can play in the nickel, a guy that can play deep, both safety spots. He can play boundary corner. So I think Malachi Starks is such a good, versatile, just technically sound DB who you can play really in any role you need around that piece in Jesse Bates, who I think is more cornered into one specific role, but he's really good at that role, and you can kind of float Malachi Starks around him, in my opinion. And Atlanta adds a nice presence in that defense. And the Cardinals here at pick 16 are a team that I think has to add to the front seven no matter what you do. You saw them add Josh Sweat in free agency. They got Darius Robinson in the draft last year, who didn't get to play his rookie year. But this front seven is really just not where it needs to be. People have mocked edge here a lot, but I honestly think they go interior defensive line, and I think they probably go with a guy who I believe is incredibly underrated. People are not talking about him nearly enough in the first round conversation. I think it's Derek Harmon out of Oregon. Incredible pass rush upside for a 3-tech like him. Holds his own in the run for a guy not being the biggest guy in the world, but he's got absolute pass rush chops, super explosive on the interior, just absolute hammers for hands. I think the pass rush upside with him is incredibly high, and I think the league is much higher on him than most people are, to my knowledge. And here, I think he's going to be a really polarizing player that we haven't talked about yet, that really, people fall in one of two camps. Either you think he's going to be a bona fide top 10 guy, or you think you don't ever want your team to draft him in a million years. And that's going to be Shamar Stewart out of Texas A&M. Shamar Stewart is somebody I'm a lot higher on than those people. I understand the production scares people, only having 1.5 sacks in his last year at A&M, only having 4.5 sacks total in his whole career at A&M. But you watch him in that defense, and he was constantly shoehorned into this 4-eye 5-tech contained player who never actually get to rush the passer. Now, he does need to finish better, 100%. He needs to get better at finishing sacks when he gets in the backfield. But guys with generational athleticism like this at edge just really don't come around often. The Bengals desperately need help on the front seven. You saw them put all the resources into offense and skill positions around Joe Burrow. The defense was the problem all year. And you need to add a guy who has an incredibly high floor as a run defender. In my opinion, Shamar Stewart can be on the field your first 2 downs no matter what happens to the pass rusher with him. So I think he's an incredibly valuable addition to that defense. And here at 18 are the Seahawks. And the Seahawks are an interesting team because I think their biggest needs come on the interior of the offensive line, but that's a position you really don't see the NFL value nearly as much anymore. And I don't think this is one where they're going to take them that high. So I think this is probably where you see Mike Macdonald, the defensive head coach, go and get his guy in Nick Emmanwori. You saw him come from Baltimore, where he had that Kyle Hamilton, that big, massive athletic safety as a weapon, just roaming around the back of that defense. And I think that's what Nick Emmanwori can be for him in Seattle. You go and get the heir to Cam Chancellor from that Legion of Boom of a bygone era. But Nick Emmanwori, athletic freak, another guy back-to-back generational athletes at their positions, their respective positions. And I think Nick Emmanwori can be a really, really just weapon, a really lethal weapon on that Mike Macdonald defense. I think he can use them very creatively, and that's a great fit in Seattle. And here at 19 is going to be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who I think have to go either edge or inside linebacker. I don't think there's an inside linebacker worth taking here past, Jihad Campbell and Jalen Walker. I see Jalen Walker as an edge personally, but people have him in different positions. With both of those gone, I think it has to be edge. And the guy that pops to me is Donovan Ezeraku, the edge out of Boston College. The bendiest speed rusher in this draft, in my opinion, has a lethal cross chop. Very, very good run defender, super long arms. Another guy I'm a lot higher on than most people. I think he's a great fit, just tailor-made to fit that Todd Bowles defense. He feels like such a Todd Bowles edge rusher. So I think he goes at pick 19. And here at pick 20 is going to be a controversial one, to my knowledge, from the Broncos people that I have talked to. I believe this is going to be Colson Loveland. This is a pick we saw for a long time with that whole Joker thing from Sean Payton that gets thrown around all the time. We saw that for a long time. Then they signed Evan Ingram, and you saw people kind of tailor away from it. But I don't think that Evan Ingram prevents you from taking Colson Loveland. Evan Ingram is a guy who's going to be basically your power slot receiver. He's never going to be a tight end that plays with his hand in the dirt, playing as an inline wide tight end. And I think Colson Loveland can be. People talk about Colson Loveland in that same vein as just a power slot, never a guy you want being in line. But I think Colson Loveland is being incredibly undersold with his blocking ability. This is a guy who was an inline wide tight end for a Jim Harbaugh offense. This guy can block. Is he the most powerful blocker in the world? No, but he's certainly capable of putting his hand in the dirt and playing an inline wide tight end role. He's the most polished separator I've ever watched as a tight end prospect. He's a great athlete, at 245, coming in a lot heavier than people thought he would be. So I think he kind of solves that position permanently for Denver, and he can work really well in tandem with with Evan Ingram in 12 personnel sets. I think that's a great pick for Denver right there, starting off that Sean Payton offense, helping out Bo Nix. And here at 21 is going to be, I think, one of the first major surprises of this draft. I think you're going to see the next quarterback go in Jalen Milroe to Pittsburgh. You've heard a lot of smoke around these guys. I think Jalen Milroe, not a guy I would touch in the first 2 days, let alone on day one. But Pittsburgh has desperately needed an injection of talent at the quarterback position ever since Big Ben retired. They just they floated through the Mason Rudolphs, the Justin Fields, every quarterback since then, the Kenny Pickett's, and nothing has worked out for them. Mike Tomlin is desperate. I think he's getting towards the hot seat, even with his legacy. And you need an injection of talent at the quarterback position. And Milroe is the guy you're just taking a flyer on when it comes to the traits. You're hoping he can develop into a guy with those just lethal athletic athletic traits that he has. You're just really hoping he can develop on the mental side of quarterback and turn into a starting caliber quarterback for them. And here at 22, I think is a team that would love for Colston Loveland to fall here. But like I said, he goes to 20 in this mock draft. And I think they have to go weapon on offense, right? This needs to be a skill position. You look at receiver, Quinton Johnston is still just not nearly the player you want. Not a guy you can rely on at any level. Ladd McConkey has turned into a star. He's going to be your Z for a very, very long time in the future. He is your dynamic weapon. But I think you can't really go into the season with only Ladd McConkey as your only guy on the outside. You lost Josh Palmer in free agency. So I think here they go out and get Emeka Egbuka, the receiver out of Ohio State, who's another player, much like Jahdae Barron and Jihad Campbell, who has just aced the interview process so well. He's such a cerebral, great football mind. Teams love him. Will he be stuck in the slot? Maybe. I think he can play on the outside, but a lot of people see him as a slot receiver only. But even if he is, Ladd McConkey's your outside guy. So put Emeka Egbuka on the inside. You've got 2 great receivers for Justin Herbert. You get him some help, some offensive weapons. You go and sign Najee in free agency. You got a pretty solid offensive core there in LA. And here at 23 of the Packers, and there's the meme every year about do they take a receiver in the first round? It's been however many decades since that happened. And people mock it every year, and it never happens. And I don't think it's a surefire thing. There's a lot of directions they could go with this pick. But I think in this mock, you have Teteroa McMillan falling as far as he did. I think the Packers are infamous for their kind of physical thresholds where they need guys to be a certain length and a certain height and a certain athleticism level and a certain character. But I think Ted McMillan checks off enough of those boxes. You need a true wide receiver 1 in Green Bay. You've got Jaden Reed, who's a great piece, but I think he's more of a kind of wide receiver 2, second fiddle Z type guy who could play to a big slot, and Ted McMillan could pair very, very well for Jordan Love. And I think that's a great fit there in Green Bay. Now, 24, this is a weird one because I think, like I said, I'm not doing trades because I think they're too unpredictable and it would kind of ruin the exercise, in my opinion. But I think 24 here with the Vikings is as sure as you can get to a guaranteed trade on draft night. The Vikings only have 4 picks in this entire draft, so I think it's almost guaranteed that they trade out of this pick. Somebody comes up to get a player here at 24. But for the purpose of the exercise, I'll take it as if the Vikings were going to stick and pick. And I think this is where we see Will Johnson finally go off the board. I think Will Johnson's fallen a lot further than people think. But Will Johnson is a guy who I think the NFL is a lot lower on than most of draft media is. There's some concerns about the medical history. There's some red flags there. I think there's concerns about his top end level of athleticism. But he's a very, very smart corner, very technically sound, great in zone, can play in man as well. He's versatile. They need help on the outside there on the boundary in Minnesota, and I think he would fit extremely well in that Brian Flores defense. And here at 25 is the Texans, and this is probably the easiest pick of this whole mock, and it's going to be Josh Simmons. In my opinion, he's the offensive tackle 1, just purely based off tape. I know there's the knee injury is obviously a major concern. There's been some character concerns get floated around. I understand that, but purely based off of tape, I think he has the best tape of any tackle in this draft. You saw them trade Laremy Tunsil even after having CJ Stroud get battered and bruised for an entire year because the offensive line was so bad. They go and trade their franchise tackle. But I think you get a new one here in Josh Simmons. It looks like the medicals are on the up and up. I think he's getting clean as far as we can tell at the current minute. I don't have any concrete information on the character concerns, so I can't really speak to that front. But I think getting a tackle this talented for a position of need there in Houston to really protect your quarterback there in Stroud is going to be a really solid move for them. And here with LA at pick 26, I think is going to be the next surprise. And the closer I get to the draft, with only being a week away, I really feel more confident we're going to see 4 quarterbacks go in the first round, which is baffling to me because there's not a quarterback I would take before day 3 that's not named Cam Ward in this draft class. But I think Jackson Dart is a really, really good fit with Sean McVay. I think Sean McVay is looking past Matthew Stafford. You probably got your last year Matthew Stafford coming up now. I know they just renegotiated there, but it's more of a 1-year, maybe 2-year type deal. And you're looking to get a new quarterback for Sean McVay, a guy that can sit for a year or two behind Stafford and really learn. And I think that fits Jackson Dart well, a guy who needs to learn how to process and work in an actual NFL playbook after running such a non-translatable scheme at Ole Miss. And I think Sean McVay is looking to get his quarterback of the future to sit and learn for a year or two. And here at 27, Baltimore, Mike Green is still on the board, and I think this is where he finally goes off. He deserves to go higher than this. Just with how this mock fell, there wasn't really any place I felt comfortable taking him. But Mike Green is such a talented player. The off-the-field concerns are bad, for sure. There's a lot of NFL teams really concerned with that, but the Ravens have shown they don't really shy away from players like that. Mike Green is probably the most diverse pass rusher in this draft class, in my opinion. He wins in so many different ways. He's a great athlete, a good run defender, very, very well-rounded edge rusher who I think is going to add a significant amount of talent to a kind of shaky front seven there in Baltimore. And here at pick 28, I think you're going to see back-to-back edges go because as good of a team as the Lions are, edge is a massive hole for them. Outside of Aiden Hutchinson, who's obviously coming off of a very bad injury, you have no other edge rushers on that team. You lose Zadarius Smith in free agency, obviously. And I think here is where you see Mykel Williams go, the edge out of Georgia. Detroit's type at edge rusher that they've shown. They love the big, physical, long edge rushers that are they don't like the speed guys. They want the big, powerful edge rushers who can stop the run and play on early downs. And that is Mykel Williams to a T. Very, very top end athlete, very, very young, a lot of room to develop behind that Dan Campbell defensive staff. Here at 29 is Washington, who is another team I think could use edge, but you're seeing the edge board dry up a little bit. Not really any of these guys I would feel comfortable taking here at the end of the first. Another team that needs secondary help. I think that's probably where they end up going because you had Marshawn Lattimore at the trade deadline last year, but he really wasn't the force you needed in that secondary that was still very, very questionable all the way to the end for them. And I think Trey Amos is the best fit for them here out of Ole Miss. A very, very long, thick press corner. Extremely physical at the line of scrimmage. You really see the stopping power in his hands when he jams a guy at the line of scrimmage. You see the receiver just like physically alter off the line of scrimmage because he has so much stopping power in those hands. Good athlete, technically sound corner. Doesn't guess often. Just a very, very sound first-round talent at corner. I think he has a lot of juice to that secondary in Washington. And here at pick 30 are the Bills. For them, I think with Trey Amos is a guy they'd like to add, but with him being gone one pick before that, they really need to add some talent on the interior defensive line there, opposite of Ed Oliver. That was a very, very weak position for them in 2024. And you see Kenneth Grant, the defensive lineman out of Michigan, falling all the way to 30. I think that's where his slide stops. People call him the dancing bear, the guy that moves like he does at his size, can plug gaps like he can, just an incredible run defender with a good amount of pass rushing upside as well. Very, very strong hands. I think he fits very well in that Buffalo defense. And here at pick 31 with the Chiefs, a couple of different directions they could go with this pick. Obviously have a hole at offensive tackle after losing Joe Thuney and Kingsley Suamataia kicking inside to guard. Well, they'll play him this year. Kelvin Banks is still on the board, but I think Kelvin Banks is another guy that the NFL is a lot lower on than people think. And I think a lot of times it's a cop-out to just mock an offensive lineman to the Chiefs. And I think you're looking at Luther Burden right here. Still on the board. I know there's character concerns with him as well, but in my opinion, he's the wide receiver 1 of this draft class still. He's so talented, and I think that's probably where Kansas City would go. I know you had Xavier Worthy last year. You've got Rashee Rice coming back from that. You got Hollywood Brown still as well, but there's a lot of questions in that receiving room. Every single person in that receiving room has, whether it's character, whether it's medical, whether it's both in Rashee Rice's case. That's just a receiver room that needs a constant at receiver, and I think Missouri looks to or Kansas City looks to keep Luther Burden in state from Missouri and put on the red there in Kansas City. And here at 32 to round this out, the Eagles are going to pull off their usual steal at 32 and just take a very talented player with some major character concerns in Walter Nolan out of Ole Miss, in my opinion. I think Walter Nolan is a guy that you see with he started out this process as a bona fide top 10, top 15 guy. And I think there's flashes of that on his tape. There's flashes of him being a dominant 3-tech. But to me, the problems are he's just so inconsistent, so spotty and streaky. You'll see him have 3 games where he looks like a top 10 player at 3 tech, and then he'll have 3 more games where he completely disappears off the field. And you compound that with the major character concerns that the NFL are very worried about. I think you're going to see him slip a lot further than people think. But this is the type of player that the Eagles have shown to take a chance on, right? You just lost Milton Williams to New England in free agency. I think Walter Nolan is a perfect stylistic fit to fill that role. And the Eagles have not shied away from the character concerns of guys like that before. And that is going to wrap up the 2025 mock draft that we are doing today. I would love to hear any thoughts in the comments. If I screwed up your team and you want to get me fired, please let me know down there. I'm always here for the discourse and to chat back and forth with you guys. And I appreciate all of you tuning in, and we will see you guys in the next one.